Crack! "Keep your guard up, Master Opal," said Gontak. The huge, broad-shouldered war form stood a respectful distance from where he had knocked his young charge to the ground. The cluster of barbed horns on his head formed a complex crest, which bobbed and rearranged in a variety of patterns to subconsciously display mood and temperament. Right now it was bowed in servility, but minute twitches hinted at frustration. "Try again," he said. Opal scrambled to his feet. His crest horns were not fully developed, and now they hung limp, a sure sign of boredom and inattention. He made a half-hearted charge at Gontak. Gontak blocked the thrust and whacked Opal across the chitin plates of his back, sending him sprawling. "Guard up, Opal." "That's Master Opal to you, slave," snapped a figure striding into the room. This high form, far thinner and shorter than the weapons master, eyed Gontak with regal distaste. "He is the brood prime of the Kiddick clan, someday First Father, and he deserves your respect." "Yes, sir," muttered Gontak. "Opal, your combat lessons have run late," said the high form. "Run along to your tutor." "Yes, Sixth Father," said Opal. He leapt up, horns nodding into childish delight. He threw down his staff, scampering off excitedly. Sixth Father sighed. He was merely the sixth brother in his brood, and of no position to debate with the decisions of his olders and betters, but it seemed questionable that the education of his clan's sole heir rested in the hands of an alien slave. Opal ran along the halls at a breakneck pace. He dodged maids, sped through the kitchens, skipped down flights of stairs, lower and lower down the enormous tower that made up the bulk of the Kiddick clan's urban estate. Pastel paint and polished chrome gave way to steel, which in turn gave way to orange terracotta. At last he reached a wholly unremarkable door and began knocking furiously. "Squishy," he called, "I'm here for my lesson." The door opened to reveal his tutor. "Master Opal," he said, making a short bow. "It is a pleasure to be seeing you on this fine day. Please come in." Opal entered. Opal's mother had laid no other eggs in his brood, an unusual occurrence in his species, and she doted on him. He had a room filled with rare and expensive toys from across the Brindican rings. He had a room lined wall-to-wall with strange exotic pets. Every night he slept on a bed large enough to fit 12, in a room big enough to fit 8 such beds. Squishy's quarters were neat and cramped. Shelves of worn books covered one wall, a crude blackboard covered the other. An old beaten-up writing desk sat in the corner. A spindly table, a threadbare rug, and a pair of chairs were the only other furnishings. It was Opal's favorite room. "Have you finished the readings that I'd given to you?" Squishy asked. He pulled up a chair for his pupil. Opal squirmed up onto the seat. It was strangely fashioned, Squishy having made it himself to suit his alien frame, but by now Opal could usually sit on it in a comfortable fashion. "I did," he said, "but I had a question about the planets. How come it says they're named after animals, but none of them are?" His tutor's face lit up. "A good question," he said. "The answer, Master Opal, is being that they are indeed named for animals, but not in the language that we are now speaking. They were named by a much older civilization who were the first to identify all 12 planets in this solar system, and who also spoke a very different language than ours." "Then why not just call them by the names we have now? It seems simpler." "That is a much more difficult question," said Squishy. "A question that lacks a clear answer. The closest reasoning to an answer is being that many people do not like changing what they have known for a long time, and also that using old names makes many people feel as if it has more importance. For instance, on my own species' planet of origin, the planets are named after the gods worshipped by the culture that had discovered them." "I guess that makes sense," said Opal. Squishy smiled. "Very good," he said. "Now let us be returning to Chapter 7. They had bought Squishy 3 years ago at the slave markets. Third Father was in need of a new house slave, and deigned to descend from the Kiddick clan estate to the teeming streets below. Arm in arm with Mother, he deflected the pressing, insistent merchants peddling low work forms, and glanced over the hulking war forms sold by scarred, grizzled dealers. In the Grand Zoo, where slaves of all species and varieties were arrayed, he inspected Gruntharks, hard-working but stubborn and willful, Tilipin, easily controlled but flighty, and Porovo, docile and incapable of nearly any complicated task. When Mother tugged upon his arms, a creature was standing placidly in the corner, a species beyond Third Father's experience. A sign on his chest, next to an astoundingly low price, read simply, "Teacher." Of course, once Mother had seen that, She just had to have the slave. There were precious little visitors to the Brindican rings, and few even of them were educated. Mother insisted that her precious brood-prime child have as broad and wide an education as possible, and this strange creature would clearly expand her son's horizons. Third father was skeptical, but a few minutes' conversation revealed the thing to be fluent in 6 languages, well-versed in the sciences, and impeccably polite. And again, remarkably cheap. This, likely, stemmed from an unappealing physique. The teacher creature towered above third father, almost the height of a war form, but was far too thin and scrawny to be capable of any hard labor. Its head was completely denuded of horns, instead coated along the top in fine black hair. Its skin had no cast color, being the reddish-brown of baked clay, and of course it had no hard spots whatsoever, just soft flesh without chitinous plates. They had bought him and brought him home, whereupon Opal had taken one look at the soft alien and immediately dubbed him Squishy. And that was Squishy, hairy like a rat, naked like a frog. Within 2 weeks, he was Opal's favorite tutor. "Squishy!" Opal beat on the door. "I need to ask you something." He heard frantic motion from within. After a minute or so, Squishy pulled the door open. Rather than his usual meticulous attire, he wore a loose robe made of some fluffed material. His face was speckled with sweat. When Squishy had first been purchased, Opal was fascinated with the way water erupted from his tutor's skin in the hot seasons. Squishy had explained that it was his species' method of cooling during heat and exertion. Indeed, on days when the sun beat down harshly, when masters and slaves alike lay torpid in the shade, Squishy could be found out and about, cheerfully attending to his duties with no sign of discomfort. Squishy took a moment to speak. His chest was heaving, as if opening the door were some gargantuan effort. "Master Opal," he said when he had caught his breath, "my sincere apologies. I was not expecting our lesson for several hours. Please come in." "What were you doing?" said Opal, his curiosity quashing his urgent mission. The room had been rearranged. The desk was pushed against the wall, the table and chairs moved to the bedroom to clear a wide space in the middle of the room. "And what is that?" He pointed to a bizarre piece of furniture at the edge of the clearing. It looked almost like a coat rack, but with a thick center pole and 3 arms jutting out at odd positions. A 4th arm stuck out and bent sharply towards the ground. Squishy coughed. "That, young master, is, He paused for a fraction of a second. "My dancing partner." "Your dancing partner?" Opal asked, bewildered. "It's a log!" "Yes. Well, I have not been able to find a suitable partner, you see," said Squishy. He seemed almost embarrassed. "Humans are not common travelers, and the Brindic anatomy proves too inflexible for the proper movements. The dummy is useful for my purposes." "Can you show me?" asked Opal. Again, the fractional pause. "I apologize, Master Opal," said Squishy, "but it would likely be of no interest to you. I am badly out of practice, and fear that I would not be able to give the dance justice." "Oh," Opal said, disappointed. "I've never seen a human dance." Squishy smiled. "Perhaps someday," he said, "when I am more confident in my ability. In the meantime, I believe you had a question for me." "Oh yes," Opal said. "I forgot. Mother told me that the whole planet spins around really fast all the time, but if that's true, why don't we go flying off?" "Ah," said Squishy, nodding sagely. "A perplexing problem." Squishy had no crest, but Opal had realized long ago that his race showed emotion through the position of their facial features. He had made a long study of his tutor's face until he could read the alien's moods with comfortable ease, pleasure and enjoyment, the mouth curving upwards, when Opal asked an interesting question, or when the housekeeper told him a particularly droll joke. Respect and obeisance, or was it preoccupation? The eyes staring straight ahead when First Father deigned to address the house slaves. Disappointment and severity, lines above the eyes, mouth curved downwards, when he was down 3 hands in the weekly night of cards he played with the cook and the gardener, and Gontac, and of course, his default expression. The mouth straight, but a hint of a smile. Polite, mild amusement, as if he could see a joke that no one else could. "Why haven't you ever told me a human war story, Squishy?" Opal said, idly swishing a stick about like a sword. He had begun to hit the age when boys become obsessed with glorious battle, and his combat lesson with Gontac had filled him with reckless energy. His tutor paused, hand stretched to pluck the day's lessons from a high shelf. "War stories?" he said. I am begging your pardon, Master Opal, but I did not think them worthy of telling. What do you mean, not worthy? Opal said. Do humans lose a lot? I bet they lose a lot. Is that why you don't want to tell me any? It is not the shame of losing battles, Master, said Squishy. Certainly my species has won and lost its share of wars, the latest of which has resulted in my delivery into your service. The reasoning for my reluctance is that I do not find such stories appealing. You should hear one of Gontak's stories then, said Opal. He told me about when he fought the Mycric clan at the Overflow. He showed me a great big scar on his stomach. He said he killed 17 war forms and never got a scratch. He pulled himself off his seat and began hopping around the room, fencing invisible enemies with his stick. He imagined legions of war forms falling beneath his sword, their lasers skittering off his mighty power fields. His armies were driving the enemy back to the river. They were chanting his name. Abruptly, the stick was yanked back. With a yelp, Opal fell back and smacked against the floor. He looked up to see Squishy peering down at him, holding the stick. And did Gontak tell you of the 17 widows who cried for their lost husbands? He said. The 17 broods crying for lost fathers? He still wore his perpetual expression of mild amusement, but there was suddenly an edge to his voice. The hundreds of Mycric soldiers who died screaming to protect their master's property. The hundreds of his fellow Kittic soldiers who died screaming that your first father might acquire a few hundred square clicks of land? Opal, wide-eyed, scrambled to his feet. I don't... Did you perhaps imagine yourself as their slayer? Said Squishy. Did the possibility not cross your mind for a single moment that you might be the one slain? That a beam overwhelm your defenses for one unfortunate instant, or a blade slip past your guard? The amused expression was gone. In its place was not anger, but a deep and terrible seriousness. That you might be pinned to the ground under the bodies of friend and foe, suffocating and helpless, while the war forms climb over the pile of stinking corpses to butcher you. That would never happen, stammered Opal, now thoroughly terrified. The war forms are forbidden from attacking high forms. Oh, and that is better, is it? Asked Squishy. To kill with abandon, knowing no one will dare raise a hand against you? Slaves bending their necks to your blade for fear of what their families would suffer if they resisted. Is this what passes for glorious combat in the Brindican rings? He threw away the stick with a titch of disgust and turned to face his books, as if Opal were not even in the room. Anger is a time-honored method of clearing fear from the spirit. As his shock faded, Opal was suddenly flooded with outrage. How dare a mere slave speak to him, the brood prime of the Kittic clan? And what do you know about honor? He burst out venomously. Gontak teaches me how to fight and be brave. Are you teaching me how to be a coward? Squishy took a deep breath, still facing the wall. That is not what I am teaching you, Opal, he said. He turned, and his face was still serious. There are indeed moments when bravery is needed, when violence is the necessary path, but they are few and far between, and should never be sought after, and none of them are stories worthy of telling. You think my ancestors' stories aren't worthy of telling, cried Opal. Righteous fury spurred him on. You're just a slave. I am the sole brood prime of the Kittic clan, heir to its proud dynasty. You stand there and insult your master? He had expected fear or obeisance or anger in return. What he did not expect was the return of Squishy's habitual amusement. Yet in an instant, the brooding seriousness had vanished, to be replaced with that wry smile. Quite articulate when your pride is wounded, it seems, he said. I should remember to jab at it in our writing exercises. He sat down in his desk chair, crossed his legs, smoothed his robes, all as if he were conducting an ordinary lesson. Insulting, you say? Perhaps. But it is a poor teacher that cannot speak the truth as he sees it to his pupil. Is the truth an insult to your clan, Opal? Don't mock me, slave, Opal spat out. I could have you beaten. I could have you sold to the asteroid mines. He needed something, anything, to wipe that smirk from Squishy's face. I could tell anyone a word of what you've said today, and you'd be hung for treason. He stood with a shaking finger pointed at his teacher. Squishy's face changed not a bit. Are you going to? Opal stopped. His rage flagged. Suddenly he saw himself standing there, not as a powerful master disciplining a defiant slave, but as a stupid boy threatening his friend with pain and death. No, worse than that. An unruly child throwing a tantrum at his teacher, His finger dropped and he hung his head. "No," he said. His cheeks burned with shame and sick humiliation. I'm sorry, Squishy." Squishy's expression softened. "I accept your apology, Apple," he said, "and I must apologize myself for losing my temper. Do you accept my apology?" I do. Thank you, Master Apple. And now that we both are treating each other with the respect that we deserve, I would like it very much if, when we are meeting for lessons, you address me as teacher. Is that an acceptable proposal?" "Yes, teacher. Very good. Let us now be discussing Chapter 7, please." "Teacher," said Apple, putting down his pen, "is there anything bad happening right now?" Squishy seemed to pause carefully before answering. "Why would you be thinking that, Master Apple?" It was high summer now, just on the verge of debilitating, but deep within the Kiddick Tower's base, Squishy's rooms were dark and cool. "Everyone has been acting strangely," said Apple. "First father and second father argue all the time, and third father just stays in his rooms all day. Mother has been crying, I've heard her, and none of them have left the house in weeks." His teacher steepled his fingers, a human expression of surprising dexterity. Apple knew it meant that he was struggling to find what to say. "It is certainly nothing for you to be worrying of, Master Apple," he said. "Adults have their moments of conflict and argument, and of course the heat is keeping all of us indoors." "It's not just the heat, teacher," Apple cried. "It's everyone. I've been to the kitchens and none of the servants will talk to me. They just stare through me like I don't exist. I had a combat lesson with Gontak today, and the way he looked at me, I didn't like it." He swallowed. "It scared me. Everyone is strange, and I'm not allowed to go outside the tower and no one will tell me why." He stared desperately at Squishy. "Please don't lie to me, teacher. You're the only one who's even bothered to answer me at all. What is going on?" He halted, confused and lonely, and a little bit embarrassed at his outburst. Squishy was looking at him, fingers still crisscrossed, wearing a grave expression he had not seen since their only real argument several months ago. "Very well, Apple," he said finally. "I will not lie to you, although I would rather not burden a boy of your age with truths such as these." He sighed. "There has been unrest in the conversations of the servants as of late. As I understand it, uprisings have occurred in several clan cities." He paused. "Bloody uprisings." Apple gaped. "Do you think it might happen here?" "Assuredly not, young master, but even so, it has put all members of the house on edge, and it is not something to be easily explained to a child. I would suggest we put it out of our minds and return to our lesson." The air shattered. A concussive wave of sound and force struck the two of them, sending them flying against the walls. When his tumble had finished, Apple lay stunned, feeling the building rock and shake under the grasp of some terrifying blow. As the rumbling died away, he could hear screams beyond the door, screams of terror and yelling, but the yelling was not a cry to maintain order or directions. These shouts were angry, and as they became louder, the terrified screams seemed only to rise in volume. "Teacher," he said. He peered over the upturned table and saw Squishy standing before the entranceway, tensed as if the door itself were about to attack. "Stay behind the table," Squishy snapped. Apple ducked quickly back down. They stayed that way for minutes, listening to shouts indistinctly filter through the door, while more and more screams were cut short. After what felt like an age, the door was yanked open. Behind it stood Hondo the cook and Bodal the gardener, and Gontak behind them. Their crests were flared in full combat pose. All were armed. Bodal had a machete, and Hondo a long, square cleaver. Gontak held his 3 war knives, one a curved slicing blade, one a thin stabber, one a heavy chopping knife. Every blade dripped with thick blue blood. Squishy untensed a fraction as he saw them. They did as well. But, Apple noticed, their crests remained unchanged. "Greetings, Hondo, Bodal, Gontak," his tutor said. "What is happening, please?" "The revolution has come, Squishy," said Bodal. "Across the city, work forms and war forms are throwing off their chains and visiting vengeance on their masters. The first father is dead. We are slaves no longer." Apple shrank back in horror behind the table. Beyond the trio, he saw the body of 8th father draped across the tiles in a pool of cobalt blood. He couldn't see his head. Squishy smiled politely, but his eyes were cold. "Congratulations, my friends," he said. "I am happy for you." There was a long pause, all the friends standing motionless, the three with crests flared, Squishy with his smile that was not a smile. "We are here for the child, Squishy," said Gontac finally. "Move aside." Squishy did not. "The boy is innocent," he said. "He's a high form," said Hondo. "He's tainted. Even the young ones will seek to oppress us again if we give them the chance. It's in their genes. Now move aside." Again, the human did not move. 4,000 years of slavery and torment is a terrible burden to carry, he said. But we would not be people if we could not make our own choices. He glanced back towards Opal, cowering against the wall. This is not a master, or a highborn, or some infective evil. This is a child. Will the first act of free people be the murder of the innocent? All of them tensed. Their crests rattled and thrummed with rage. Hondo stepped forward. "House slave!" he seethed. "I should have known where your loyalties lie. You will take their side even now?" "Opal's side? Certainly," Squishy said, still smiling. "How glorious it must be to make war upon children." Hondo bellowed and swung his great cleaver at Squishy. The human moved like water. He caught at the cook's arm, ducked under the blow, and came up behind Hondo, still holding the cleaver arm now bent at an awkward angle. He pulled upwards. Groaning with pain, the cook was forced downwards. His other arms clawed frantically behind him, but could not bend appropriately to reach the tutor. Squishy gave a powerful wrench on the arm as he struck with his other hand at the elbow joint. There was a staccato beat of meaty cracks as Hondo's arm snapped in two places. The cook shrieked shrilly and collapsed to the ground, clutching at his shattered arm. All took place in less than 5 seconds. Startled but no less enraged, Bodal came forward and swept his machete towards Squishy's head. In the long stretched time of adrenaline, Opal realized exactly what had befallen Eighth Father. Once again, the human became a force of flowing motion. He leaned back, unnaturally back, farther than any Brindican could lean, and the blade swung an inch above his head. He came up before Bodal could recover and kicked savagely at the gardener's knee, which blew out to the side with another sickening crack. Bodal fell sideways, hissing curses through his mandibles, and swung at the human again. This time Squishy stepped inwards, turning away from Bodal to catch the gardener's upper arm on his shoulder, before seizing the machete hand with both hands and wrenching down. Once again, a crack as the elbow joint stretched to its limit and gave. Squishy grabbed the machete from limp fingers and turned to grasp the gardener's head with his free hand, smashing it into the wall in the same motion. A wet crunch, and Bodal slumped unconscious to the ground. This took about 8 seconds. Gasping, the tutor straightened from the tangle of limbs, machete in hand, and turned to the end of the hallway. Gontac stood there, shocked. His knives were lowered, and his crest had sunken, twitching now with stunned surprise and perhaps a touch of fear. But he looked at Opal, peering from the upturned table, and he looked at Squishy, panting and pouring sweat, and back to Opal. And now his crest was up. His knives were raised, and this soft pampered thing was standing between a blooded warform and his vengeance. He took a step forward. Squishy pointed the machete at Gontac. "Do not try it, my friend," he said sadly, but there was steel in his voice. "Please." Gontac snarled and charged. An instant later the human was charging too. Opal came out slowly from the table and moved to the doorway. Past the fetal whimpering cook and the concussed gardener, he could see Squishy and Gontac in the middle of the hallway. The warrior and the tutor were locked together, motionless, tangled in a desperate embrace. Blood trickled from them, mixing with a red, dark liquid to swirl together on the floor. Opal climbed over workform limbs to reach them. He put a tentative hand on his tutor's back. "Teacher?" he asked. "Squishy?" The tangle shifted, and he heard Squishy groan. The human pulled himself free of Gontac with difficulty. 2 of the warform's knives were embedded in his flesh, and as they came free, the strange red fluid began flowing from Squishy's wounds in short pulses. Opal realized that it was human blood, and looked away for a moment, nauseated. Gontac stared at nothing, breathing raggedly. The machete was stuck deep in the thin gap between the chitinous plates of his belly and his chest. As Squishy pulled it loose, the warform's legs suddenly began twitching furiously, thrashing about and stirring up the pool of blood before slowing and finally stopping as his body collapsed. Squishy found a pillar to sit against. His hands were jammed into his stab wounds. His eyes were screwed shut from pain. "There is a small bag with a red cross under my bed, Opal," he said. "Please get it for me." "Yes, teacher," said Opal. He scurried frantically to the bedroom and found it, a black leather bag with a large cross in neat red paint. He returned. Squishy took the bag and pulled a number of strange items from it. As his tutor cleaned his wounds, Opal steeled his nerve. "Teacher," he asked, How did you fight like that? How did you learn?" "I was not always a tutor, Opal," said Squishy. He pinched the edges of a cut shut and pressed a device against it. There was a chunk, and the device moved to reveal a metal staple in the skin, holding the cut together. "For a very long time in my life, I did many things that I wish I had not." Chunk. "And when it was over, I decided that I would never be that person again." Chunk. He struggled to his feet, using Opal for support. "We must be moving quickly now, Opal," he said. "There will be much danger in the time ahead." "Yes, teacher." Opal hesitated. "Squishy, thank you for saving me." As far as gratitude went, it seemed completely inadequate. Squishy smiled at him despite the pain. "Few and far between, Opal," he said. "We can only be hoping there are no stories told of us." The market square was deserted under the merciless heat of noon. The shoddy mud bricks lining the square had begun to crack. The very air danced and shimmered. On days like this, not so long ago, not even the slaves would be sent out. High forms and work forms and war forms alike would retreat to the darkest crevices they could find and sleep until the late afternoon when the heat was tolerable. Even now the revolutionaries dozed in the depths of reclaimed houses, their stained knives forgotten under the terrible equalizer of the summer sun. And yet, in a square scoured of civilians, a figure cautiously emerged. No Brindican form this, but a brown, bare mammalian in slaves' robes, balanced precariously on two spindly legs. Tall as a war form, but any war form would laugh at the comparison. "How skinny it is," they would say, "and no plates. The lowest warrior could break this alien like a twig." But then they would see the eyes. They were not the wide-set, multifaceted eyes of a Brindican. These eyes were forward-set with rounded pupils. They moved unceasingly, flitting across the empty market, analyzing, evaluating. They ran over a knife stuck fast in a chopping block, a rack of shoddy jewelry, a forgotten squash rotting in the sun. Each innocuous item was pinned, examined, and discarded in turn by the piercing focus of a predator's eyes. When the square had been swept to its satisfaction, the creature twisted its mouth and gave a sharp whistle. A small high form scampered out from some hidden alley. The moody horns atop its head were knotted into fear and caution, but it ran to the alien without hesitation. Together, they ducked into a narrow passage and were gone. Squishy pushed open the warehouse door with the squealing protest of a dozen years of rust and grime. The room beyond was piled high with what looked like baskets, twisted into nefarious forms by the gloom. "This should suffice for the time being," he said. He swung his bag to the ground. It clinked with scavenged food tins and some simple tools. He began to dig into the dusty baskets. In no time at all, there was a small wicker burrow, almost entirely hidden from prying eyes. "Be quick now, Opal," he said. Opal scurried into the crevice and gave a small sneeze. Squishy smiled, for what seemed like the first time since the world had upended. "It is best to get your sneezes out now, Opal," he said. "You may need your silence later." He reached a hand into the burrow and laid a hand on the child's tangled crest. It seemed to ease a bit at his touch. "You will be all right while I'm gone." "Yes, teacher," Opal said. Once, not so long ago, the dark would have frightened him, but he had seen the horrors people could commit in broad daylight. Now the dark was a welcome respite. From his face, it seemed that Squishy could see his ward's thought process. He sighed. "Very good, Opal," he said. He straightened and turned to the door. "It is time to see who in this city still possesses a soul." It was another of Squishy's uncanny talents. He could enter the house of a complete stranger and within minutes of idle conversation know if they were trustworthy. If they were not, he would politely excuse himself, return to Opal, and hunker down for another night of cramped discomfort. But if they were... After another half hour or so of cautious probing, he would bring Opal to them. Their reactions were always different. One, an old work-form matron, had embraced him and wept as if he were her own child. Another, a gruff war-form blacksmith, studiously ignored the high form, refusing even to acknowledge his existence. A workform accountant had thrown books and pens at Squishy, shouting to get out, to take his little monster with him, that they would be the death of him and his family. But in the end, all had given them sanctuary. They never stayed at one home for more than one night. Safer for everyone involved. In the cool gloom, Opal methodically laid out his belongings from his little bag. Little more than a week ago, he had owned 1,000 toys, slept on sheets of Matran silk, ate meals cooked by the finest chef in the district. Now he took stock. A rough blanket, a rusted pocket knife, a half-dead flash lamp he knew better than to use. As he looked at them, he felt a hollowness inside him. He could feel it ache, not for his things, his toys, his bed, his food, not for his mother, who was certainly dead. He had locked the thought of her deep, deep away in a place he dared not touch. No, the absence he felt, the memory that rose and made his eyes smart, was of days not filled with fear, spent in a small, neat room with a blackboard and a writing desk. "Teacher," Opal said, "what would you do if you were free?" It was raining, one of the occasional monsoons that would strike with a fury and rain for weeks on end. Even in the depths of his family's tower, he could hear it drumming, faint but steady. The steady scratch of chalk on the blackboard paused. "I believe, Opal," Squishy said, "that I would take a very long vacation." "Where would you go?" "I would take a ship back to the Terran territories if I could," the tutor said. "I have built what life I can here, but it would be good to be among humans once more." "But you would come back?" Opal asked, trying to keep an anxious note out of his voice. Squishy smiled. "Of course, Opal," he said. "I have my reputation to think of. What would people be thinking of me if the next tutor to come along filled your head with nonsense of all sorts?" Opal relaxed and tried to comb the worry out of his crest. "Of course," Squishy added, "I would have to begin charging for my lessons." He paused thoughtfully. "And I believe there would be a considerable amount of back pay." Opal woke at the sudden creak of the door. With practiced slowness, he pulled a basket over his hiding place. Trembling, he peered out towards the dark hallway. A shape grew, coalescing into Squishy's familiar figure. The tutor was breathing heavily and bled his strange red blood from a gash on his forehead. There was blood speckled on his sleeves as well, but it was not his own. "Opal," he called. Opal shoved the baskets aside. "Teacher, what happened?" Squishy seemed not to hear the question. "Pack your things quickly," he said. "We must be leaving in haste." He began plucking his belongings from the ground and stuffing them into his bag. Opal was bewildered. "But what happened?" "Now is not the time for questions, Opal," the tutor snapped. "We have little enough of it to waste." Opal screwed up his eyes. "Tell me," he said. It was not quite a shout. Squishy stopped packing. He looked piercingly at Opal. "Opal," he said, "do you understand that all I have done, all that I now do, is for your protection? That I go to these places to secure your safety in this unsafe time?" "Yes," Opal said. "And do you understand that should many learn that there is a human traveling with a highborn child, that your safety would be compromised? That they would seek out every hiding place until we were found, and I would no longer be able to protect you?" "Yes," Opal said. "And do you understand," Squishy said, "that should I make an error, and someone who cannot be trusted realizes my secret, then they would alert everyone they could find, and that for your protection, I would be forced to take steps to ensure that this secret would not spread. Do you understand this?" "Yes," said Opal. It came out as a whisper. Squishy straightened. "Then please, Opal, do not be asking me what has happened." He resumed packing. After a moment, so did Opal. Traveling by night was more dangerous than by noon. Even in the smallest hours of the morning, small gangs of workforms wandered the city streets, clutching knives, clubs, and torches. They patrolled with less fervor than in the early bloodshed, but even now, over a week since it began, they still found the occasional high form that had survived the initial massacre. The pair's flight was measured in starts and stops, long, tense periods of hiding in the shadows, punctuated by mad, frantic rushes before the next patrol could round the corner. They did not enjoy the luxury of speech. Run was a tug forward, hide a tug downwards. For one long, agonizing moment, a workform gang paused right beside their hiding place to drink and talk. Crouched within a patch of foliage, Opal could have reached out and snatched a workform's weapon from his belt, but in time, they moved along, and then it was another dash to the next piece of cover. I believe we have but one day's journey further, Opal, Squishy said, before we reach the spaceport. They were hiding in a junkyard, tucked away inside a rusted-out vehicle. He had swept the broken glass from punched-out windows and cleared a spot to lay their blanket over jagged tears in the floor. Through a gash in the roof, Opal could see stars. What happens then? Opal asked. Then we must be rolling dice, said Squishy. If we can get to an alien craft, I can plead our case to its captain and gain passage away from the Brindican rings. If we cannot, we must settle for a local ship. The crew would undoubtedly be unwilling to aid in our endeavor. However, we would likely be able to stow away in the cargo hold. It would be more difficult, but it is an option. This is the step most full of risk, Opal, but once it is completed, we will be quite close to safety. Opal mustered up the courage for his next question. And what if they find us? He asked. What if the captain won't take us? What if they want to sell us out to the mobs? In the dark, he could sense his tutor weighing his words carefully. Then I will do what I must, he finally said. They lay there in silence, until Opal could hear Squishy's breath become slow and soft. Then, when he was sure the human was asleep, he slowly rose. With as little noise as he could, the child climbed out of their hiding place and made his way into the night. Alone. It was all pieced together quite neatly in his mind. The mobs were looking for high forms, not for humans. If a human was found harboring a high form, both would certainly be killed. But a human alone? They would be free to go as they pleased. He could not have gotten this far without Squishy, of course. But now that the end was in sight, and Opal knew what to do, there was no point endangering him anymore. Not when the risk was so high. Perhaps Squishy could protect him, but Opal was not sure if he wanted that anymore. Not when he could see time and again how much it cost his teacher to do so. When Squishy was a slave, Opal had not freed him. He had lacked the wisdom and the will to do so. But here and now, Opal saw, he could at least free his tutor from responsibility, from danger, from suspicion and exile, from violence inflicted and received. It was quite a grown-up decision, he felt. He had come to this part of the city before, when he was younger. Mother and fourth father had brought him to greet some relative or another coming in through the starport. He had been very young, but even now he could remember the way. What he had not counted on was the wandering patrols that drove him down unfamiliar alleys and strange streets. Every frantic detour to escape approaching torches took him farther from memory. In no time at all, he was hopelessly lost. Opal stopped in a small, secluded plaza off the main streets to gather his bearings. That way ran east and west, and he'd gone left to take it, and a right before that, and he was sure the street before that had been familiar, so it must be. Too late, he noticed the glow of torches growing behind him and the tread of careful feet. It wasn't until he heard the faint sound of steel clearing leather that his mind managed to piece together all the clues into one horrifying conclusion. And then there was nothing to do but turn. There were 8 of them, all work forms, all armed. Some held long knives, some short, thick clubs. In the back, Opal could see one held a huge industrial nail gun in a stocky fist. Their leader, closest to him, had one broken horn on his crest that seemed to give him a permanent sneer. He had stripped his slave's robes bare to the waist and wore a high form's blood-stained clan necklace. In his upper right hand, he held a machete. "Are you all alone, little master?" he asked. His voice was surprisingly even-toned. Opal had expected some sort of guttural growl, but the question was as genial as if they spoke in a crowded market. "Are your parents here?" Opal became painfully aware of how neatly he was trapped. His back was pressed against an iron gate. High walls flanked him on either side. His head twitched back and forth, searching for an escape. "I asked you a question, little master," Brokenhorn said. His voice took on the hint of an edge. "It would be impolite not to answer." Opal managed to shake his head wordlessly. The leader looked back at the gang and gestured with his long machete. "Keep him alive," he said. "He may be lying." He turned back to the child. "But they'll come when they hear him scream." They advanced slowly. They were in no hurry. They knew he was trapped. Opal looked at their faces, trying to find some ounce of mercy or pity. He found none. There was something unspeakably dispassionate about their expressions, as if they were performing a mindless chore. They would slaughter him as casually as they would livestock. No, not like livestock, like vermin. Opal screwed his eyes shut as they closed in. He'd been a fool to think he could survive on his own. He prayed for something, anything. Excuse me, gentlemen, if I may please be having your attention. The mob paused, struggling to process the unexpected voice. Then they turned. Behind them stood Squishy. With one arm, he held one work form struggling helplessly in a complex grip. In the other, he held the nail gun. "It is not my preference to cause undue harm," he said, as calmly as if he were discussing the weather. "So I would ask you all to please leave the child and be on your way." No one seemed inclined to move. Broken Horn hefted his machete. "What's he to you?" he asked. "I am his tutor," Squishy said, "and he is my ward." Their crests flared. "House slave!" the leader snarled. He took a step towards the human, raising his blade. "You traitorous chunk!" The captive workform screamed as Squishy pressed the nail gun to his palm and pulled the trigger, punching an inch-thick spike through the meat of his hand. Broken Horn halted his charge, shocked. Squishy's voice cracked out like a whip. "Gentlemen, with each step I will be forced to cause your friend further distress," he said. "As it stands, with the proper medical attention, his hand may be restored to full working order in time." He pressed the nail gun to the sobbing workform's wrist. "Now once more," he said, "I am asking you to leave the child and be on your way." Broken Horn looked back towards Opal. Opal could see him thinking, just 3 steps, and he would have a hostage of his own. He tensed for movement, and k-chunk! The sound came with the crack of shattered chitin and bone, as the next bolt obliterated the workform's wrist. Broken Horn whirled back around. "Do not be looking away from me, please," Squishy snapped. "You understand that I must treat such things as a threat and respond accordingly." He hefted his captive, who had fainted dead away. "I'm afraid his hand is now permanently maimed. However, he still possesses 3 working hands with which to ply his trade." His expression darkened. "That may change." Opal marveled at the control Squishy held over the mob. By all rights, they should have swarmed this strange alien and torn him apart. And if he had killed one of their own, they would have. But they were unprepared for this measured, methodical cruelty. Every time they threatened to come together, they were shocked back into hesitation. It was a delicate balance, and it could not hold forever, but for now he kept them paralyzed in indecision. "Opal," he said, "to me, please, with haste." Opal scurried between the work forms. He could feel the frustration and bewilderment boiling off them. One dared to glance down at him, tensed his knife. "Chunk." "That is his other left hand ruined," Squishy said. "Finding work will now be quite difficult for him. I do not believe he was right-handed." Opal made it the rest of the way without issue. When Opal was by his side, Squishy heaved his unconscious captive to the ground. "Now, if you would, please take him and go," he said. "He is badly in need of medical care." Broken Horn spared not a glance at the body. Slowly, he raised his machete to point at the tutor. "Now you have nothing. We are 7, and you are 1. Squishy matched his stare. "It is true that fighting all of you at once would be quite difficult, yes," he said. "I'm afraid it would be necessary to escalate immediately to lethal force. Understand that this is not what I wish." He leveled the nail gun at Broken Horn. "Gentlemen," he said, 9 days ago I killed a blooded warform in single combat." His voice turned cold. "Do not test me on this night." There was a long, terrible pause. Finally, Broken Horn gestured with his blade. "Get him to the hospital," he said. "This one's not worth our time." 2 of the workforms came forward nervously and grabbed their comrade, dragging him carefully by his arms that had not yet been ruined. Slowly, with many glances back, they filed out of the plaza. Bringing up the tail was Broken Horn. He stared for one long, inscrutable moment at the human and the high form before turning at last into the night. The tension broke. Opal spun to embrace Squishy, just as he dropped the nail gun and lifted the child into his arms. "Teacher," Opal sobbed. "I'm sorry I didn't—" "Hush now, Opal," said Squishy. He pressed his forehead against his student's crest. "I know why you ran, and if our circumstances were reversed, I could not say that I would not have done the same. But understand, Opal," he said, "that to lose you now would destroy me as thoroughly as any blade or bullet. I am responsible for your well-being. You must be responsible for mine. May this be our agreement?" Choked up, Opal could only nod. Squishy lowered to the ground. "Good," he said. "Let us be leaving at speed. Now the matter of finding the right ship." It was high noon. Even in their dark hiding place, looking out over the deserted spaceport, the air felt thick and choking from the heat. Through the shimmering dance of heat haze, they could see hundreds of starships, nestled together like penned birds. The vast majority were Brindican, graceful, swooping vessels whose wings folded neatly into themselves to save room. Dotted here and there, though, were a variety of others. Opal recognized some. A Vuth trader, bulging with cargo holds, a Mindareth bark, all delicate spires and cables, even an Ililan cruiser, an arrowhead bristling with cannons. All the tension seemed to flood out of his teacher. "Do you see that ship, Opal?" he said, pointing. Snug between two graceful Brindican vessels was a bulky, squat alien shuttle he did not know. Where its neighbors were smooth and unblemished, this craft was pitted and scarred. Whatever paint had once been smeared across it had long since been scorched away by years of repeated re-entry. It almost seemed to hunch between the prettier ships. "Were we to find a Mistosi ship," Squishy said, "I would have been glad. The Mistosi are a cautious race, but they are great lovers of stories, and I would have had more than enough to keep them entertained for our trip entire. Were we to find a Potiritan ship, I would have been content," he said. "My Potiri is rather rusty, but they are a very physical race. They run fighting pits in their ships and treat their fighters well, and I have encountered enough Potiri to have the measure of them. Were we to find a Ubrax ship," he said, "I could have managed. They take on no passengers for free and hold no truck with stowaways. But they are, to a man, keen on gambling and have many tells. An hour at their showy table and I'd likely be able to buy passage outright. But never in our terrible flight did I expect to find a ship such as the one before us now." He smiled. "That, Opal, is a human ship." The ship captain was not what Opal had expected. Squishy had told Opal long ago that humans did not have broodcasts like the Brindicans. They had no squat work forms, no burly war forms, and no spindly high forms. The tutor had taken it as a point of pride that any human was born with the capacity for any station, and yet this human captain was as near the opposite of Squishy as Opal could fathom. He was short where the tutor was tall, thick where he was thin, pale and red-veined where Squishy was brown. Squishy's hair was piled neatly atop his head, while the captain's spread downwards to cover the lower half of his face in a thick thatch. Still, there were similarities. Quick, darting eyes with pupils and whites, unlike the uniform black of Opal's. The soft, unchatined flesh that earned Squishy his sobriquet. Just a single set of arms and legs, giving them the air of being terribly unbalanced. Soft, unbalanced, weak. Certainly the impression they drew from the Brindicans, but Opal had seen what they could do. What one of them could, at least. Getting in had been simple enough. Squishy had packaged Opal snugly in a crate, popped it onto a hand truck, and walked it right past throngs of workforms straight to the ship. The crew was rushing about to load their cargo. One more human drew little notice. By the time the humans realized they had an extra crewman, Squishy was in the cargo hold with his package, demanding an audience with the captain. Now they stood alone in the captain's quarters, Opal, picking straw out of his crest, Squishy, standing straight as a rod, hands crossed behind his back, and the captain, pensively picking at his teeth with a sliver of wood. "Asylum," he said, rolling the word around in his mouth. His voice slurred at the sibilance where Squishy's was clean and clipped. "On my ship," he said, "people pay for their passage." "With respect, sir," Squishy said, "I invoke Amendment 68B of the 3rd Terran Concordat. Any human under unjust persecution from an alien power may request asylum and passage from any Terran vessel to be compensated upon end of journey by the nearest Terran embassy. Failure to provide such carries significant repercussions." "I know the law, Flotsam," the captain said. He idly twitched the toothpick, working at a scrap of food between molars. "But we're a long ways from the Terran territories. Next stop I say we met no hide nor hair of you, and who's to say any different?" "That is, of course, your choice," said Squishy. "Of course you would have to explain what happened to the human veteran you took aboard." He reached to his neck, pressing just below the jaw. A small glowing red pattern lit up beneath the skin. "The ship picked up my tag as soon as I entered," he said. "Technology may have improved since I was on a Terran vessel, Captain, but I believe scrubbing your records of such an event without flagging the drive remains quite impossible." The pick paused. "A sly one thinks he is," the captain grumbled to himself. "All right, you've got your ticket," he said. He gestured at Opal. "And what about him? He ain't human." "No, but he is an innocent," said Squishy. "A refugee. Too risky, the captain grunted. We get searched, he gets found, it's my head. Would you turn him away to the ones outside? Squishy said. You know what they would do to him. Opal shivered, almost imperceptibly, and his tutor put a reassuring arm on his shoulder. His voice took on an edge. Is your soul as damned as theirs? The captain slapped the desk, came to his feet. You risked the lives of my crew just bringing him in here, he snarled. Now you want I should give him birth. He's a highborn. The teacher didn't flinch. He's a child. Both men stood that way for a time, eyes locked, one furious, the other icy. The toothpick wobbled as the captain's jaw silently flexed. He broke first. All right, he shouted, and spat the pick away. Damn you, Flotsam, I'll take the boy, and mark me and mine for slaughter, but I will. He stuck a hand like a slab of meat forward. Good, said Squishy. He reached out to meet the captain's hand in a firm grip. If you are needing any assistance on our journey, I have 8 years of Navy experience. I am rated for up to Class 4 loading vehicles and Class 6 reactor maintenance, and I'm capable of handling myself in the case of pirates. He released the handshake. And I can cook. The captain fell back into his chair. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly. You daft holdout, he finally managed. Why didn't you open with that? Squishy met his gaze firmly. I wanted the measure of you, Captain, he said. And now I have it. A swift rap came from the door. One of the crewmates came in, a human bulky enough to rival a war form in size. We got trouble, boss, he said. Skitters, in the cargo bay. The captain heaved himself out of his chair. Figures, he sighed. I'll be down in a sec. Keep them away from anything troublesome. The crewman gave a quick nod and closed the door. If the authorities are on board, Captain, said Squishy, they may intend on searching the ship. Oh, don't worry about that, Flotsam, said the captain. He moved to the wall and smacked it with a meaty fist in no place in particular. One of the waist-high wall panels that looked no different from the others popped out with a squeak, revealing a narrow crawl space. He smiled through his thick beard. We're well practiced in hiding what's looked for. The space was small, but no worse than many of the spots the pair had hidden over their ordeal. In unspoken unison, they moved along the well-padded space, towards a small grate that held the only source of light. Do you think he'll give us up? Opal whispered as they crept. This captain is a man of peculiar honor, Squishy murmured, as occasional men of his profession are. He may have tried to negotiate a better deal, but I suspect his mind was decided the moment we came aboard. Opal peered through the grating. A cluster of pipes cunningly hid the opening while offering a wide view of the cargo hold. The crew were packed tight in the space, still processing the last of the cargo. Most were human, of varying shapes and colors, but the occasional alien could be seen in the crowd. What really drew Opal's attention, however, was the 3 war forms at the center of the room. Their crests showed arrogance, and they moved with the casual swagger of their station. That might have had to do with the blue sashes that stood out against their crimson chitin, marking them as trade enforcers. Or maybe it was the narrow-range beam rifles slung at their waists. They lorded over the cargo bay, eyeing every box and package with lazy suspicion. Opal's heart quickened as one of them looked directly at the grate, and he only began to breathe again when the war form finally glanced away. The captain bustled up, grabbing a wrench and rapping it against a hatch. Pipe down, you miserable lot, he cried. These are heroes of the revolution, these are. Ain't none of you know how to show some hospitality? The war form in front inclined his head downwards. You are the captain? That's right, the captain said, grinning. We represent the Free Brindican Nation, he said. Yeah, I remember you from our last run before the flop, said the captain. World turns upside down and you're still there in the middle, huh? The enforcer's horns twitched. We're looking for a high form, the leader said. Young, male, not yet branched. We'll be sure to keep an eye out, the captain said. You making house calls across the dock, or are we just special? He's traveling with a human, said the war form. His tutor, a house slave. And you thought he might seek his own? The captain sighed. A real deduction, that is. He's dangerous, the war form said. Since the revolution, he has assaulted and murdered a number of citizens, including a blooded war form. Did he now? The captain raised thick eyebrows. Can't look too good for you lot. A war form killed by a schoolteacher. Quick with a ruler, was he? The leader's crest flared in anger. He seized the captain by the collar and dragged him forward. His voice went cold. "Let me make myself clear, human," he said. "We will search every meter of this ship. We will disassemble it piece by piece if need be. And if we find the highborn on your vessel, the lives of every one of you will be—" He stopped. Each crewman in the hold had, as one, picked up tools that were not quite weapons. The slight first mate sat atop a crate, testing the edge of an angle grinder with studious care. The burly sailor Oppel had seen earlier now swung a tremendous spanner idly back and forth. In the corner, a lanky human with a shaved head sparked up a cutting torch, and everywhere in between was a variety of items that could theoretically be put to lethal use. The enforcer to the right reached for his rifle and halted as behind him a buzzsaw revved. Warforms had been bred for generations to hone their combat instincts. Now, it seemed to occur to the warriors that for all its searing firepower, a long-barreled rifle was perhaps the worst weapon you could choose for a close melee. The warforms drew together, caught by a terrible uncertainty Oppel had seen before. The instant they drew their firearms, those tools would become weapons. But for now, they remained merely tools. These warriors were not prepared for the hair-thin edge between peace and violence that humans seemed to wield like a knife. Only the captain remained empty-handed. He pried himself from the warform's loosened grip. With languid grace, he pulled a toothpick from his pocket and slotted it between his teeth. "Now here's what's going to happen," he said. "I, as a respectable ship captain, will assure you that I have not seen any highborn whelp. And you, as honorable civil servants, will take me at my word. And we, as honest sailors, will let you know if some highborn strays onto our dock." He slapped a hand against the lead warform's chest. Even reaching up, it barely met. "Don't worry about us," he said. "I got a good, hard-working crew here, the lot. We can handle a tutor." He left just the barest emphasis on the we. Again, the pregnant pause that Oppel had learned to associate with humanity. The warform broke first. "I will take your word, Captain," he said stiffly. The crew eased, and the tension lightened a degree, but they did not let go of the tools. He made a gesture, and the enforcers turned on their heels. They walked out with the same swagger that they had coming in, but their crests told the real story. The captain watched them go, not moving until the bay doors had closed behind them. "Let's wrap it up, people," he said finally. "I got a fearsome premonition we ain't got long to leave." Oppel blinked in the sudden light as the captain hauled the panel away. "Up you get, boys," he said. They came out from the crawl space, Oppel taking a moment to stretch all his arms while Squishy straightened to his habitual length. The captain leveled a gaze at the tutor. "Best get stowed away quick, the both of you. We aim to take off before they come back in force. We'll find you some quarters. They may not be expansive, but—" he glanced at the crawl space. "Something tells me that won't be a problem." "It will not, Captain," said Squishy. He clasped his ward's shoulder. "Come along, Oppel." Oppel looked up to the captain. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I know what you risked by protecting me." The captain gave a hearty laugh. "Oh, he's a sweet one, ain't he said to Squishy. He clapped a tremendous hand on Oppel's free shoulder. Oppel's knees buckled. "Let me tell you a secret, little flotsam," he said. "We've got enough contraband squirreled away on this ship. Them finding you would be the least of our plight."